A human soul is not a thing to be weighed on a merchant's scale, not a commodity to be bartered for a root in a jar. But in a world brittle with desperation, the line between a person and a possession can blur into the dust, and a 13-year-old girl can be traded for a bottle of ginger, leaving the man who received her to reckon with the impossible weight of his new reality. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments where you are watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The air in the town square was the color of rust and tasted of defeat. It clung to the back of Elias's throat, a familiar bitterness he had long since stopped trying to wash away. He stood by his cart, a shadow among other shadows, men whose faces were carved with the same harsh lines of drought and despair. He wasn't there to sell, merely to watch the slow, grinding death of a community he had once belonged to. Then came the man, a scarecrow stitched together with sinew and shame, dragging a smaller, more fragile shadow behind him. Elias knew him, or the ghost of him. His name was Abel, a farmer whose land had turned to cracked clay and whose hope had withered on the vine. Abel's eyes, sunk deep in their sockets, found Elias's. They were not the eyes of a trader, but of a man at the edge of a cliff, about to throw the last precious thing he owned into the abyss. In his hand, he held a small, dark bottle filled with a cloudy liquid and slices of ginger, a potent, sought-after remedy for the lung fever that stalked the town like a patient wolf. Elias recognized the bottle. He had two more just like it, hoarded away, a private bulwark against a world that had already taken everything from him once. "Elias," Abel rasped, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. He didn't gesture to the bottle, not at first. His gaze flickered to the girl beside him, a child so thin the wind threatened to snap her. Her face was a pale oval, framed by dark, tangled hair, her eyes fixed on the dirt as if it held the only truth left in the world. "I need it," Abel said, his voice cracking. "My wife. She burns." Elias said nothing. He felt the weight of the town's collective gaze, the silent, hungry judgment. He was known as a man who had, a man who kept, a man who had walled himself off from the suffering of others. Abel's desperation was a performance for an audience of one, and Elias was that audience. Finally, Abel's hand, trembling, pushed the girl forward. A slight, almost imperceptible nudge. "Leah," he whispered, the name a puff of smoke. "She is strong, a good worker. She does not eat much." The words were a desecration. They hung in the air, obscene and glittering with the sweat of a father's ultimate failure. Elias looked from the father's hollowed-out face to the child's bowed head. He saw not a bargain, but a mirror. He saw the reflection of his own past failures, his own desperate barters with fate that had left him empty and alone. He should have said no. A decent man would have turned away, would have given the medicine freely, would have spat on the very notion. But Elias was not a decent man. He was a broken one, and in that moment, in the suffocating heat and the stench of decay, a cold, bitter logic took hold. Refusing would be a judgment. Accepting was an act, an event, a thing that could be contained and then forgotten. He reached out a hand, not for the girl, but for the bottle. Abel's fingers were slick with sweat as he made the exchange. The glass was cool in Elias's palm. He did not look at the girl. He could not. The transaction was complete. Abel turned and walked away, not looking back. His shoulders stooped as if he'd shed a weight only to have a mountain settle in its place. The girl, Leah, remained, a silent testament to a world gone wrong. And Elias, clutching a bottle of ginger, was left with his purchase. The journey back to his homestead was a silent procession of two, a man and the ghost he had just acquired. Elias walked ahead, the dust kicking up around his worn boots, his shoulders set in a hard, unyielding line. He did not look back, but he could feel her presence behind him, a small, constant pressure on the air. It was the feeling of being watched, of being judged by a pair of eyes that had already seen the worst of what men could do. His house was not a home. It was a fortress built of silence and solitude, perched on a rise overlooking the parched valley, as isolated as his own heart. The wood was sun-bleached and silver, the windows small and grimed, watching the world with a permanent squint. Inside, the air was cool and still, thick with the scent of dried herbs, wood smoke, and loneliness. It was a space meticulously ordered to hold a single life, and her sudden entry was a disruption on a fundamental level. She stood just inside the door, a small, frozen figure in the gloom, her hands clutching the frayed edges of her dress. She did not look at him, her gaze fixed on a crack in the floorboards, as if it were a map to some other, better place. Elias felt a surge of irritation, a sharp, unwelcome feeling. What was he supposed to do with her? She was a stray animal brought into a sterile room, a thing that did not belong, a problem with no solution. He moved past her, his movements stiff and deliberate. He placed the newly acquired bottle of ginger on a high shelf alongside the others, the 3 bottles standing like grim sentinels. He stoked the embers in the hearth, filled a kettle with water from the barrel, measured out grain for his own meager supper. He did all the familiar, mindless things that structured his days, hoping the rhythm of routine would somehow erase her presence, or at least muffle it, but it was impossible. The silence in the house was different now. Before, it had been his own, a chosen, curated emptiness. Now it was a shared silence, heavy and fraught with everything unsaid. It was her silence, a vast, terrifying ocean of it, and he was drowning in it. Every creak of the floorboards under his weight sounded like a thunderclap. The scrape of his spoon in his bowl was an act of violence. He was acutely aware of her stillness, of the soft, almost inaudible sound of her breathing. He had bought a person, and now that person was breathing his air, occupying his space, her very existence a constant screaming accusation. He finished his meal and set the bowl down with a sharp clink. He looked at her then, properly, for the first time since the transaction. She hadn't moved. She was a statue of fear, and he was the monster in the museum. The thought was a shard of glass in his gut. He had not wanted this. He had not wanted her. He had acted from a place of cold, weary detachment, and now the consequences were standing in his kitchen, real and terrifyingly small. A part of him, a cruel, hardened part, wanted to yell at her, to order her to a corner, to treat her like the possession she was supposed to be. But he couldn't, because when he looked at her, at the hollows beneath her eyes and the tremor in her clasped hands, he didn't just see a problem, he saw a wound. And he was the one holding the knife. Days bled into one another, each one a perfect, suffocating replica of the last. The sun would rise, painting the dusty landscape in shades of pale gold, and Elias would rise with it. He would move through his chores with a grim, practiced efficiency, tending to the few scrawny chickens that still laid, mending a fence that bordered nothing but wasteland, chopping wood he didn't yet need. He worked to fill the hours, to build a wall of labor between himself and the silent girl who now inhabited his house. He designated a small cot in the corner of the main room as hers, a space demarcated by an invisible but palpable line. He would leave food for her on a small wooden stool beside it, a piece of bread, a bowl of thin gruel, an apple from the last of his winter stores. He would leave it and turn his back, unable to watch. Later, when he would return to the room, the food would be gone, or mostly gone, the bowl wiped clean. It was their only form of communication, a transaction of sustenance devoid of all warmth, a grim parody of care. He told himself it was enough. He had taken her from a place of immediate starvation. He was providing for her physical needs. This was the extent of the bargain, but the logic was a flimsy shield against the growing unease in his soul. Her silence was not passive, it was an active, formidable force. It filled every corner of the house, seeped into the wooden beams and the mortar between the stones. He found himself listening for a sound from her, a cough, a sigh, the shuffle of her feet, and the absence of it was a constant low-level hum of anxiety. He learned the patterns of her quiet existence. She would stay on her cot until he left the house. Then she would slip out like a mouse to use the privy, her movements swift and furtive. He would catch glimpses of her through the window as he worked, a fleeting shape in the shadows of the room, always still, always watching. One afternoon he returned to find the bowl of stew he had left for her untouched, a skin forming on its cooling surface. A hot, unreasonable anger flared in him. It was a wasteful, defiant act. He strode over to the cot, his boots loud on the wooden floor. She was sitting there, her back ramrod straight, her small hands clenched in her lap. She flinched as his shadow fell over her, a small, violent shudder that went through her whole body. The anger vanished. instantly replaced by something colder and sharper. Guilt. "You have to eat," he said. The words came out like rocks, a gravelly utterance from a throat long accustomed to silence. It was the first time he had spoken directly to her since they'd arrived. The sound of his own voice was alien in the room. Leah did not look up. She did not answer. She only shrank further into herself, her shoulders drawing in as if to make herself smaller, to disappear entirely. And in that small, terrified movement, Elias saw it. He saw past the abstract concept of the traded girl, past the symbol of the town's decay, and his own moral failure. For the first time, he saw the child. He saw the sheer, unadulterated terror in the rigid line of her spine, in the white-knuckled grip of her hands. He wasn't just a provider of shelter. He was a captor. The house wasn't a refuge. It was a cage. And he, with his silence and his stomping boots and his grim presence, was the monster she feared. The realization was not a thought, but a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. The silence that rushed back in was no longer just empty. It was filled with the sound of a child's fear, and it was the most damning sound he had ever heard. The sight of her flinching, the stark animal terror in that small movement, was a key turning a lock deep inside him. The carefully constructed walls of his present came crumbling down, and the past flooded in, not as a gentle memory, but as a raw, gaping wound. He was no longer in his dusty, silent house. He was standing in the mud and the rain, the cold seeping into his bones, a younger man with a different kind of desperation etched on his face. He saw his wife, Sarah, her face pale and waxy in the flickering lamplight, her breath a shallow, rattling thing in her chest. The same fever that haunted the town now had haunted his life then, a merciless thief. And he saw another small figure, a girl with hair the color of wheat and eyes that held all the light in his world. His daughter, Alara. She was 6 years old and she was fading. The memory was a sensory assault. He could feel the uselessness of his own large hands, how they had felt too clumsy to soothe a fevered brow. He could smell the cloying scent of herbal poultices that did nothing, the damp earth outside, the metallic tang of his own fear. In the memory, he was frantic. He had bartered then too, not a child for medicine, but his pride for a promise. He had gone to a traveling apothecary, a man with shrewd eyes and a silver tongue, who sold him a bottle of miracle tonic for a price that took the last of their savings and the silver locket that had belonged to Sarah's mother. The bottle had been dark, filled with a cloudy liquid and slices of ginger. He had carried it home like a holy relic, the glass cool and heavy with the impossible weight of hope. He had poured the liquid down his daughter's throat, his hands shaking, praying to a God he no longer believed in. For a day, it seemed to work. The fever receded. A flicker of life returned to Alara's eyes. He and Sarah had clung to each other, a fragile bubble of relief in a world of pain. But it was a false dawn. The fever returned with a vengeance, fiercer than before, as if angered by the brief reprieve. The tonic had been nothing but spiced water, a cruel deception. The apothecary was long gone, and Alara was gone soon after. The memory didn't end there. It twisted, showing him the aftermath. The crushing silence of the house, a silence that was the blueprint for the one he lived in now. Sarah, a hollowed-out version of herself, her spirit extinguished, who faded away a season later, not from fever, but from a broken heart. And him, Elias, left with nothing but the empty bottle and a guilt so vast it blotted out the sun. He had failed. He had not been strong enough or smart enough or quick enough. He had been tricked, and his daughter had paid the price. He had hoarded the ginger medicine ever since, not as a remedy, but as a penance. The bottles on his shelf were monuments to his failure, a constant bitter reminder of the one time he needed a cure and couldn't provide it. He stumbled back from the cot where Leah sat, the force of the memory making him physically dizzy. He braced a hand against the rough wooden wall, his knuckles white. He looked at the girl, so small and afraid, and the two images, Leah and Alara, blurred at the edges. The past wasn't just a memory. It was a ghost that had followed him into this room. His acceptance of the trade, the cold logic he'd used to justify it, was a lie. He had taken her not in detachment, but in a twisted, subconscious attempt to replay the past, to somehow gain control over a scenario that had destroyed him. But he hadn't gained control. He had just found a new way to fail. The larder was getting low. The rhythm of his life, for all its isolation, was still tethered to the town by the need for flour, salt, and oil. The thought of going back there, to the place of the transaction, was a knot in his stomach. Before, he had navigated the town's veiled contempt with a hardened indifference. He was the hermit on the hill, the strange man who kept to himself. They could whisper all they wanted. Their opinions were weightless. But now, he had Leah. She was not a secret he could keep locked away. The idea of leaving her alone in the house, even for a few hours, sent a spike of primal fear through him. It was an irrational fear, born not of logic but of the raw memory of his past failure. He could not, would not, leave another child unprotected. So, he would take her. The decision felt momentous, a crossing of a new and dangerous threshold. He gestured for her to follow him, a brusque, silent command. She obeyed without question, her small feet barely making a sound as she trailed him out into the harsh morning light. Her presence changed everything. Walking into town was no longer an anonymous errand. It was a spectacle. He was acutely aware of her, a tiny, dark-clad figure in his wake. He felt as if he were leading a parade of his own shame down the main street. The stares started immediately. The women who were scrubbing their doorsteps stopped, their hands frozen, their eyes hard and curious. The men loitering outside the saloon fell silent, their gazes following the strange pair. Elias kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, his jaw tight. He could feel the whispers like insects crawling on his skin. They weren't just whispers of curiosity now. They were thick with judgment, with a greasy, sanctimonious condemnation. He felt it most acutely in the general store. The air inside was thick with the smell of pickles and dust, and the proprietor, a portly man named Silas with small, greedy eyes, watched them approach the counter with a smirk playing on his lips. Silas was the town's central nervous system, a hub of gossip and petty power. "Morning, Elias," Silas said, his voice oozing a false congeniality. He leaned on the counter, making a show of looking past Elias to the girl hiding behind his legs. "Found yourself some company?" The word company was loaded with insinuation, ugly and sharp. It implied everything, that she was a servant, a possession, something less than human. The few other customers in the store fell quiet, their ears straining. Elias felt a hot flush of anger, but it was quickly swamped by a deeper, more familiar feeling, a burning, suffocating shame. Their judgment was merely an echo of his own. They saw him as a monster, and in his heart he knew they weren't entirely wrong. He placed his list on the counter without a word, his movements rigid. As Silas gathered the items, flour, beans, a small tin of lard, he continued his probing. "Quiet little thing, ain't she? Where'd she come from?" Elias's hand clenched into a fist at his side. He wanted to lash out, to smash the smirk off Silas's face. But what could he say? "I traded her father a bottle of ginger for her." The truth was more damning than any of their suspicions. He paid for his goods, sweeping them into his sack, and turned to leave. As he did, he instinctively moved to shield Leah from their prying eyes, pulling her closer to his side. It was not an act of tenderness. It was a possessive, territorial gesture, a defiant statement. "She is my shame, my problem, not yours." As they walked away, the whispers erupted behind them, a chorus of condemnation. He had not protected her from their judgment. He had only succeeded in making her a target, and in doing so, had cemented his own status as the town pariah. The walk back to the homestead was even quieter than the journey to town, if that were possible. The air between them was thick with the residue of the town's scorn. Elias could feel it clinging to him, a foul miasma of shame and anger. He had exposed her to that ugliness, and for what? To satisfy his own irrational fear. Back inside the sterile quiet of the house, the tension was unbearable. It was a living thing, coiling in the corners, making it hard to breathe. He put away the supplies with rough, jerky movements, the clatter of a tin or the thud of a flour sack sounding like explosions in the silence. He looked at Leah. She had retreated to her cot, to her designated space of non-existence, her back to him. But he could see the rigid set of her small shoulders. She had heard the whispers. She had felt the stares. She understood. He had to do something, anything, to break the spell of this suffocating stillness. His gaze fell upon the small, neglected patch of earth behind the house. It had once been Sarah's garden. After she died, he had let it go to ruin, the sight of it a painful reminder of the life that used to be there. Now it was a square of cracked dirt and tenacious weeds, an emblem of his own neglected heart. An idea, desperate and strange, took root. He went to the shed and retrieved a small hand trowel and a rusty watering can. He walked back into the house and stood before her. He didn't speak. He simply held out the trowel. Leah turned slowly, her eyes wide and uncertain. She looked at the tool, then up at his face, searching for a clue, for a threat. He gave a short, sharp jerk of his head toward the back door. It was an invitation, an order, something in between. Hesitantly, she stood and followed him out into the blinding sunlight. He led her to the patch of dead earth. He knelt down, his old knees protesting, and drove the trowel into the hard-packed ground. He pulled up a stubborn weed, its roots clinging deep, and tossed it aside. Then he looked at her and pushed the trowel into her hand. Her fingers, small and calloused, closed around the wooden handle. For a long moment she just stood there, holding it. Then, tentatively, she knelt beside him. She watched him pull another weed, her eyes tracking his every movement. Then she mirrored him. She pushed the trowel into the dirt, her small body straining with the effort, and dislodged a clump of crabgrass. They worked. Side by side in the oppressive heat, they worked. There were no words. There was only the scrape of metal against earth, the soft thud of discarded weeds, the shared rhythm of labor. He showed her how to distinguish a weed from the ghost of a dormant herb. He filled the watering can and showed her how to let the water sink deep into the parched soil, a drop at a time. It was a language without sound, a communication of shared purpose. In that small patch of dead ground, under the unforgiving sun, something began to shift. Elias watched her small, determined hands clearing the debris, tending to the soil. He wasn't just seeing a symbol of his guilt anymore. He was seeing a person, a girl with a surprising strength in her thin arms, a focused intensity in her brow. They were not erasing the past or fixing the present. They were simply two lonely souls, tending a forgotten garden, and in the shared, silent toil, a single, fragile seed of connection was being planted in the barren ground. The sky had been a bleached, empty canvas for weeks, but a change was coming. That evening, a bruised, purpled line appeared on the western horizon, and a restless wind began to stir the dust, carrying the distant smell of rain and ozone. The coming storm felt like a physical manifestation of the turmoil inside Elias, a gathering of all the pressure and guilt that had been building. As darkness fell, the wind howled around the small house, rattling the window panes and moaning in the chimney. Inside, the air grew thick and heavy. Elias lit a second lamp, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist in the corners of the room. He noticed Leah was shivering. At first, he thought it was from the growing chill, but as he looked closer, he saw a faint sheen of sweat on her forehead, a feverish, unnatural brightness in her eyes. She was huddled on her cot, wrapped in her thin blanket, her teeth chattering softly. A cold dread, chillingly familiar, coiled in Elias's stomach. He reached out and laid the back of his hand against her forehead. Her skin was on fire. The fever, the same cursed fever that had stalked the town, that had claimed his wife and daughter, was now here in his house, consuming this child he had so callously acquired. The irony was a blade twisting in his gut. He, the man who hoarded the cure, who had traded a life for a bottle of it, was now faced with the very sickness he had sought to command. He strode to the high shelf and took down one of the bottles of ginger. His hands, usually so steady, trembled as he uncorked it. The sharp, spicy scent filled the air, a scent he now associated not with healing, but with failure and death. He poured a small amount into a spoon and brought it to her. "Here," he commanded, his voice rough with a fear he could not conceal. "Drink this." Leah, her eyes clouded with fever, barely seemed to register his presence. She recoiled from the spoon, a weak, instinctual movement. He persisted, his desperation making him clumsy. He managed to get a few drops of the liquid past her lips before she turned her head away, a soft moan escaping her. The storm broke then. The first drops of rain hit the roof like scattered pebbles, quickly escalating into a torrential downpour. Thunder cracked directly overhead, and the world outside the windows was illuminated in stark, flashing strobes of white light. Each flash revealed Leah's small, flushed face, her expression one of vacant suffering. All his carefully constructed defenses, his gruff detachment, his bitter resignation, they all shattered. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one raging inside him. The past and present collapsed into a single, terrifying moment. He was back in that other room, with that other child, watching helplessly as a life flickered and threatened to go out. The fear was paralyzing. He was the same useless man, with his useless remedies, destined to watch history repeat itself. He spent the night by her side, a helpless sentinel. He wiped her brow with a damp cloth. He tried to coax more of the ginger into her, but she couldn't take it. The wind and rain lashed against the house, and with every gust, with every clap of thunder, Elias felt another piece of his hardened exterior being stripped away, leaving only the raw, terrified core of a man facing his ultimate failure. Again. His feelings were no longer about obligation or shame. They were not about a bargain or a possession. As he watched her fight for every shallow breath, a new and terrifying emotion bloomed in the wasteland of his heart. Care. A desperate, painful, and profound care for this little girl he barely knew. The storm raged all night, a relentless assault of wind and water. By dawn, it had subsided to a steady, weeping drizzle. The world outside was washed clean, the air cool and sharp, but inside the house the fever still held its suffocating grip. The ginger was not working. Leah was weaker, her breathing a faint, shallow rasp. The bottle he had clung to as a symbol of power and control was just a bottle. The cure he had bartered a soul for was as useless as the snake oil he'd bought all those years ago. The realization hit him not with anger, but with a profound and terrifying clarity. He was out of options. The old Elias would have surrendered. He would have retreated into his bitter fatalism, accepted this as another cruel turn of fate, another punishment he deserved. He would have let the fever run its course, a passive observer to a tragedy he felt he had authored. But the man who had sat by a sick child's bedside all night was not the same man who had stood in the town square. The fear of failure was still there, a cold stone in his belly, but it was now overshadowed by a fiercer, more urgent terror. The thought of losing her. He had to do something. He had to choose. He could stay here and watch her die, a coward hiding behind the walls of his own making, or he could face the world that had judged him, the world he despised, and fight. He looked at her small, still form, and the choice was not a choice at all. It was a necessity. He stood, his movements stiff from the long vigil, and went to a small, dusty chest in the corner of the room. It was a chest he had not opened in years. Inside, beneath a layer of moth-eaten blankets, were the last remnants of his old life. He reached in and pulled out a set of carving tools. They were fine instruments, the steel pristine, the wooden handles worn smooth from the grip of his younger, more hopeful hands. They were the tools he had used to carve the small wooden bird for Alara, the intricate floral patterns on the headboard of the bed he had shared with Sarah. They were the last tangible connection to the man he used to be, a man who created things of beauty, not a man who hoarded remedies for ghosts. He wrapped the tools in an oilcloth, the weight of them in his hands both a burden and a strange comfort. He had to go back to town. He had to face Silas. This time he was not going as a pariah seeking supplies. He was going as a man on a mission, a man with something to trade, not out of desperation for himself, but out of desperation for another. He left the house, pulling the door shut behind him, and the sound of it clicking into place was a sound of finality. He was leaving his fortress, leaving his solitude behind. The walk to town was a pilgrimage. The mud sucked at his boots, trying to hold him back, but he pushed forward, his focus singular. He walked into the general store, dripping rainwater onto the floorboards. Silas was there, polishing the counter. He looked up, his expression one of surprise, which quickly curdled into his familiar, smug contempt. "Back so soon, Elias?" Elias ignored the jibe. He walked directly to the counter and unwrapped the tools, laying them out on the polished wood. The light caught the sharp, clean edges of the steel. They were objects of quality, of a craftsmanship long absent from this decaying town. Silas's eyes, small and shrewd, widened slightly. He recognized their value. "I need medicine," Elias said. His voice was quiet, but it held a new authority. It was not the voice of a man asking. It was the voice of a man stating a fact, the real kind. For the lung fever. Silas looked from the tools to Elias's face, his smirk gone, replaced by a calculating curiosity. He saw the rain-soaked clothes, the exhaustion, the raw desperation in Elias's eyes. This was a different kind of transaction. This was not a trade of shame, but a trade of substance. Elias was offering a piece of his past, a piece of himself, and in that offering, there was no room for mockery. He was no longer running from his failure. He was sacrificing its memory to prevent another. Silas, for once, was silent. He picked up one of the carving knives, feeling its perfect balance, the keenness of its edge. He saw not just a tool, but a history, a skill that was worth more than a few bags of flour. He looked at Elias, at the grim set of his jaw and the fire in his eyes, and saw a man stripped of all pretense. The usual power dynamics of their interactions had vanished. This was not a shopkeeper lording over a reclusive outcast. This was one man seeing the raw, unvarnished desperation of another. Without a word, Silas turned and went to a locked cabinet behind the counter. He brought back a small, corked vial filled with a dark, viscous liquid. It was not the cheap ginger tonic he sold to the desperate. This was the real medicine, potent and expensive, the kind he kept for those who could truly afford it. He placed it on the counter next to the tools. The trade was made in silence. Elias wrapped the vial carefully in a rag and placed it inside his coat, close to his chest. He turned and walked out of the store without a backward glance, leaving his past behind on the counter. The journey home was a frantic race against time. The drizzle had stopped, but the sky was a heavy gray lid, and the world felt muted and tense. He ran, his lungs burning, his boots slipping in the mud. He was no longer the slow, lumbering man weighed down by memory. He was fueled by a singular, desperate hope. He burst back into the house, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Leah was just as he had left her, a fragile flame flickering in the gloom. He knelt beside her, his hands shaking as he uncorked the vial. The medicine had a sharp, bitter smell. He gently lifted her head, tilting the vial to her lips, letting the thick liquid trickle into her mouth. He managed to get most of it down her throat before she lapsed back into unconsciousness. And then, there was nothing to do but wait. The silence in the house returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was not the silence of tension or accusation. It was the silence of a vigil, a held breath. Elias did not move from her side. He sat on the hard floor, his back against the wall, and watched her. He watched the faint rise and fall of her chest. He watched the shadows lengthen as the afternoon wore on. He was no longer thinking about his failures, about Sarah or Alara. His entire world had contracted to this one small cot, this one small child. Hours passed. The light began to fade, and then, in the depths of her feverish sleep, she stirred. Her lips parted, and a single whispered word slipped out, so quiet he almost missed it. Papa. It was not directed at him. It was a phantom, a name called out in a dream to the father who had sold her. But the word, that simple, devastating word, did not bounce off Elias's hardened shell. It pierced him. It went straight through the layers of guilt and grief and bitterness, and struck the very core of him. A sound tore from his own throat, a choked, ragged sob. The dam he had built inside himself over years of solitude and pain finally broke. The grief for his daughter, the sorrow for his wife, the shame for what he had become, the terror for this child. It all came pouring out. He slumped forward, his head in his hands, and wept. Not loud, theatrical sobs, but the silent, body-racking tears of a man who had forgotten how to cry. It was a storm of its own, a violent, cleansing release. In that moment of complete and utter brokenness, he was finally free. The ghost of his past was not vanquished, but he was no longer its prisoner. He looked at Leah, her face still flushed but now peaceful in sleep, and he understood. She was not a replacement. She was not a penance. She was a second chance. Not a chance to fix the past, but a chance to choose a different future. A chance to be the man who stays, the man who fights, the man who cares. The man her own father could not be. The first light of morning crept through the grimy window pane, a pale, hesitant spear of silver. It touched the floor, the edge of the table, and then the small cot in the corner. The storm had passed, leaving the world scrubbed clean and quiet. Elias had not slept. He had remained on the floor, a silent guardian, watching and waiting as the long night gave way to dawn. Some time before the sun rose, the fever had broken. He had felt it, a subtle shift in the air, a change in the quality of her breathing. The frantic, shallow rasps had eased into a slower, deeper rhythm. The fire he had felt on her skin had receded to a natural warmth. He watched as her eyelids fluttered, then slowly opened. Her eyes, no longer clouded with fever, were dark and clear. They scanned the unfamiliar ceiling, the rough wooden beams of the room, and then they found him. He was still on the floor, a disheveled, exhausted man, and he met her gaze without flinching. For the first time there was no fear in her eyes. There was weariness, yes, and a deep, bottomless confusion, but the terror that had defined their every interaction was gone. The silence that stretched between them was new. It was not the heavy, oppressive silence of before, filled with unspoken accusations and fear. This was a calm silence, a soft, empty space waiting to be filled. It was the quiet after a long and terrible storm. Slowly, stiffly, Elias rose to his feet. He moved to the hearth, his body aching from the long vigil, and stirred the embers. He added a few small pieces of kindling and soon had a small, gentle fire going. He filled a pot with water and added a handful of oats, preparing a thin, warm broth. His movements were deliberate, imbued with a newfound sense of purpose. He was no longer just going through the motions of survival. He was caring for someone. He poured the broth into a small bowl and carried it to her. He knelt by the cot, the same way he had knelt to offer her the useless ginger, but everything was different now. He held out the bowl. She looked at it, then at him. Slowly, she pushed herself up into a sitting position, her movements weak and tentative. She reached out with trembling hands and took the bowl from him. Their fingers brushed for a fleeting second, a spark of contact in a world that had been defined by distance. She took a small, cautious sip of the broth. He remained there, kneeling, simply watching her. He had not saved her in some grand, heroic fashion. He had not erased the horror of what her father had done, nor the grim reality of the world that awaited them outside the door. He had simply made a choice. In the face of his own despair, he had chosen to act. He had chosen compassion over bitterness, connection over solitude. He had chosen to care. Through the window, the sun was now fully risen, casting a gentle, hopeful light into the room. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, turning them from symbols of decay into something almost beautiful. It fell upon the small, neglected garden patch outside, where the rain had softened the earth, where the seeds of a new beginning, both literal and metaphorical, now lay waiting. The story was not over. Their future was a vast, uncertain landscape. But here, in the quiet of the morning, with a bowl of warm broth passing between a broken man and a lost girl, it was, at the very least, a start.